In this video, we're going to talk about upcasting and downcasting. Upcasting means casting an object to one of its supertypes or parents, while downcasting means casting it to one of its subtypes. Let me show you this in action. So here I'm going to declare a control object, new UI control, with this initial state. Now, let's declare a public static void method called show and give it a parameter of type UI control. In this method, we just want to print this object on the console. So print control. And finally, let's call this method and give it our control object. When we run our program, we see what the toString method returns. Beautiful. Now, what if instead of this control object, we pass a text box object to our show method? So I'm going to declare a text box, new text box, and pass it here. This code is perfectly valid because this text box object inherits all the members of the control object. So every text box object is also a control object. That's why we say inheritance represents an is-a relationship. A text box is a control. So we pass this text box object here, and this object gets automatically cast to UI control. This is what we call upcasting. So this object is getting cast to its parent. We could also change the parameter type to object. And once again, we have upcasting because every text box is also an object. Now, let me revert this back here. Let's run the program and see what we get. This time we see an empty string. Why? Because earlier in our text box class, we overrode the toString method. So we changed the default implementation of this method. And here we're returning the text inside our text box. So back to our main class, at runtime, we're passing a text box object. So when line 12 gets executed, the toString method of the text box gets executed. Because at runtime, we're dealing with a text box object. Okay? Now here's the interesting part. Even though at runtime, we're passing a text box object here, at compile time, when we are coding this method, we don't have access to any of the methods in our text box. So if we type control dot, we only see the members of the control class. Now, what if we want to work with one of the methods of the text box class? Well, we need to explicitly cast this control to text box. So we prefix it with text box and store the result in this variable. Now, we can access all the methods declared in the text box class. So let's change the text in this object to hello world. Now, when we run our program, instead of an empty string, we see hello world. So let's quickly recap up to this point. Because the show method accepts a control object, we can give it an instance of the UI control or any of its derivatives. At compile time, however, we can only work with the members of the UI control unless we explicitly cast this control object to a different type. This is what we call downcasting. Now, there is a problem in this implementation. What if we pass our control object here? We don't have any compile time errors because this method expects a UI control. And of course, we're giving it a UI control. However, when we run our program is going to crash with an exception. Let's take a look. So we got an exception. The type of this exception is class cast exception. And here's the message. Class UI control cannot be cast to text box. Here's the reason. On line 12, we're trying to cast a control to a text box. Now, this doesn't make sense to Java. Here's the reason. Every text box is, of course, a control object, but not every control object is necessarily a text box. It could be a drop-down list or a checkbox. So that is the reason why we got an exception here. We gave this method a control object, which is more generic, and we're trying to cast it to a more specialized type. Java cannot do this. So how can we prevent this error from happening? Well, before this casting, we need to make sure that the object that is passed here at runtime is an instance of the text box class. Then we can safely cast it as text box. So here we can type an if statement like this. If control is an instance of text box, so this is the instance of operator, and this expression will return true if the object that we pass here at runtime is an instance of the text box class. So then we can safely cast it to text box, call one of its methods, and we're done. So this is all about upcasting and downcasting. Next, we're going to talk about comparing objects.